This Rolex is painfully close to being perfect. There's so many factors about this watch which I think are phenomenal. Of all the current offering of Rolexes, I think this one is probably the closest to being perfect, but there's one factor that ruins it for me. This is a Rolex 50th Anniversary SeaDweller. This is the reference. 126600. This was a controversial launch that happened back in 2017 at Baselworld, and it was to celebrate, as mentioned, the 50th anniversary of the SeaDweller, which was originally launched in 1967 with the reference 1665. It was launched to be a more capable diver than the Submariner. This was designed for saturation diving. As mentioned, the original one was launched in 1967. It's called the Double Red because, as you can guess, there's 2 lines of red text. This highlights some interesting points because Rolex typically doesn't look backwards. They don't take inspiration from old watches, or rather they don't do vintage reissues or homages to vintage. And so that's one big thing that Rolex has done differently with this watch, and they actually state it on their website. They say the dial is inspired by the original. However, Rolex is also known for not doing. It kind of feels like they purposely don't do what the community want them to do, and that's why this watch was controversial. This was the first SeaDweller to have the Cyclops added to the crystal. So it kind of feels like Rolex was teasing the community by giving them this beautiful red text on the dial, but then saying, we're still in charge. Here's the Cyclops, and we know you don't like the Cyclops. I don't actually believe that they did that to get at the community. I don't think they're that petty. There is a reason as to why they added the Cyclops to this watch. But first, let's go through the specifications of this thing. This is made out of Rolex's own stainless steel. They call it oyster steel, and it is their own 904L steel. Case is 43mm wide, it's 15mm thick, it's 50mm lug to lug, and it has 21mm wide lugs. The bezel is a unidirectional dive bezel with a ceramic insert, and all the markings on the bezel are coated in platinum. This has a helium escape valve on the side of the case, and it has a water resistance of 4,000 feet, or 1,220 meters. The movement inside is a Rolex in-house caliber 3235. It's an automatic movement with bi-directional winding. It's accurate to -2 to +2 seconds a day, and it's a COSC certified superlative chronometer. It's also anti-magnetic and has 70 hours of power reserve, which is pretty standard. All of that's pretty standard for Rolex movements. The current price of this is £11,750 or $13,300. Now let's come back to the Cyclops. The reason this has a Cyclops, I think, is because Rolex always wanted to have a Cyclops on the SeaDweller. They just didn't have the technology to do it. The Cyclops is glued onto the crystal, and there's micro bubbles within that glue. So when you go down to the epic depths that this watch can achieve, 4,000 feet, those little bubbles expand, and eventually the Cyclops just pops off the crystal. And so Rolex just left the crystal off the watch, which a lot of people loved that look, that more clean look. I personally don't mind the Cyclops. I feel like the Cyclops is kind of like the helium escape valve on the Seamaster. Yes, it would look cleaner without it, but actually I feel like it's just part of the design, part of the identity of that product. And so I quite like it. Rolex has improved the technology in how they apply the Cyclops, and so now they're able to glue the Cyclops onto the crystal without any bubbles inside, and so it's now able to withstand the epic depths without popping off. So what makes this watch nearly perfect? For me, I love watches that feel modern, look modern, but have very obvious touches or nods back to vintage stylings, vintage design. And that's exactly what this watch has. It's quite obviously a modern watch, but we have a matte black dial, where typically all Rolex sports watches have gloss dials. That matte black dial feels so much more purposeful, so much more adventurous. It feels more meaningful. It also means that you don't have epic glares all over the place. So you have this matte black dial, and then you've got that little line of red text, and I know that's subtle and it's a tiny point, but it does add a bit of color to a very conservative watch. Again, just giving it that little air of angst, maybe? I just like it. Now the other little nod to vintage, which I don't know if it was intentional or not, but the black ceramic bezel in some light actually looks quite grey, like a ghosted bezel, like the old vintage faded bezels. That, along with the matte black dial and the red text, is that's a really hot combination. Then we have the proportions. Now the SeaDweller has always been a much thicker watch than the Submariner, and therefore it wears tall, it sits tall on the wrist. But this is a wider watch than the normal SeaDweller, yet it's kept the same thickness. 43mm wide and 15mm thick, both of those measurements are large, but together they work. work. So I love the proportions of the case width versus the case thickness. I love the proportions between the 21mm wide bracelet and the case itself. But then the other thing, which I think's changed with a lot of Rolex sports watches, is that they have fat lugs, which then make the case more square. This has relatively thin lugs. They're very curvaceous. It makes the watch feel more refined and perhaps gives it a little dainty element to this otherwise very beefy looking watch. And the beefiness is actually something I really enjoy. You feel this on the wrist so much. It's a big chunk of metal and that feels nice on the wrist. I like that. So the thing that ruins it for me about this watch is just the size. So it's not the proportions. I feel like the size is in line with the rest of the design of the case. It's just my wrists are too small. This is a 43mm wide watch on my 6.5-inch wrist. I have thin wrists, small wrists, and this just doesn't fit. I feel like it's just a little bit too big, but it gives me hope. Because Rolex typically doesn't look backwards, they don't do the vintage inspired. I feel like they have Tudor to do that. But if Rolex has done this with the SeaDweller, then there's no reason why they wouldn't do this with the Submariner. These features, these little vintage touches in a Submariner would be, I'd get that in a heartbeat. I'd join the waitlist in a heartbeat. Matte black dial, red text, and those little curvy lugs. I'd be all over that. Not many people talk about this watch, so I'd like to know your thoughts on it. Have you tried it? Do you enjoy the matte black dial? What do you think about the size? The Submariner certainly gets a lot more limelight than this thing, but if you got big wrists, then I envy you because this is stunning. Let me know what you think about the controversial Cyclops that's on it. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up button. If you like to style this video, then hit the subscribe button down there and that little bell icon to get notifications when I drop a new video. If you're on Instagram, give me a follow at Bark and Jack. And if you want to check out our watch straps and watch accessories, jump over to barkandjack.com and see a whole load of straps that we have over there and straps that would fit this watch. 21mm straps. We've got loads of sizes, loads of colors. Jump over to barkandjack.com and check it out. I'll see you guys soon. Take care. Maybe I just need to work out a bit. How do you work out that bit? Maybe just doing that. Don't know.